sign sitting here, that means that you're moving this way.
No.
Okay, good.
No, in fact, we're going to head off with Professor Edelman. Good evening. I'm going to have one request, which is that all of you sitting in the way back who I can barely see, if you would like to come down to the front, we're going to try to have a little bit of a conversation about the movie, and your geographical location is going to make that easier. So please feel free, come right down to the front. That's great. My name is Antonia Fasanelli, and I'm really delighted to be here. It's been a while since I've been in DC, but I am coming to you from Baltimore, where I'm the director of the Homeless Persons Representation Project there. I'm wearing two hats this evening. I'm also representing the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty of the American Bar Association. And I'm delighted to have our staff director, Amy Horton-Newell, here, as well as my fellow commissioner, Robin Runge, in the back. And the Commission, together with the ABA's section on individual rights and responsibilities, are two entities within the ABA that have pledged this year to focus entirely on solutions to poverty and issues of poverty. And this is one of a number of fora that we are helping to put together to start conversations within local communities about ameliorating and ultimately ending poverty. It is also my pleasure to handle the introductions this evening of our very distinguished panel. I will begin all the way to the far right with Patty Mullahy Fugere. And Patty Mullahy Fugere is the executive director of the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. She was a co-founder of that wonderful, wonderful organization and served as board president before she became the director in 1991. She is responsible for the overall policy focus and management of the legal clinic. She's also responsible for starting many, many careers in legal services and public interest work, including mine. She is a member of the DC Access to Justice Commission and serves on the steering committee of the Fair Budget Coalition and the advisory committee of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. She is also a board member of the Homeless Children's Playtime Project, a program called Network, which is a Catholic social justice lobby, and the National Center for Housing and Child Welfare. She is an adjunct faculty member here at the Georgetown University Law Center, and her course, Homelessness and Legal Advocacy, is one you should absolutely take if you are a student here. She is absolutely wonderful and has been honored by the DC Bar with its William J. Brennan Jr. Award for her service in the public interest, by the Legal Aid Society of DC as a servant of justice, and by the DC Bar Foundation with its Jared Scout Prize, and by the Gray Panthers of Metro Washington with its Geraldine Britton Award. To her left is Professor Peter Edelman. And many of you know him, perhaps, as a professor of law here, again, at Georgetown. He is also faculty director of the Center on Poverty and Inequality, and most recently published the book, So Rich, So Poor, Why It's So Hard to End Poverty in America. Professor Edelman worked as legislative assistant to Senator Robert F. Kennedy from 1964 to 68. In 67, he accompanied him on the tour of the Mississippi Delta to investigate poverty in that region, and he served as Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Clinton administration and resigned in protest over the 1996 Welfare Reform Bill. Professor Edelman has chaired and been a board member of many organizations and foundations. He is currently chair of the District of Columbia Access to Justice Commission and the National Center for Youth Law, and a board member of the Center for Law and Social Policy, the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and half a dozen other nonprofit organizations. To his left is Joseph McCartin. Joe is director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor. He's an expert on U.S. labor, social, and political history, and his writings, if you haven't read them, address the intersection of labor, organizations, politics, and public policy. And he is also a professor here. And last but certainly not least, closest to me is Professor Anthony Cook, whose scholarship has explored the relationship between progressive religious theology and progressive politics in America. His book, The Least of These, Race, Law, and Religion in American Culture, explores the relevance of the social gospel and Dr. Martin Luther King's conception of the beloved community for race, class, and cultural divides in American society. For his work as a scholar and community activist who has worked with various grassroots and faith-based initiatives on community empowerment and economic development projects, the American Bar Association honored Professor Cook as one of 21 lawyers leading America into the 21st century, citing his unique synergy of action and thought. I'm delighted to be on this truly distinguished panel. The way this panel is going to run is we're each going to share our reflections of the movie for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then after that, we're going to open it up for a question and answer from the audience. So we really hope that the bulk of the time will actually be an opportunity for us to have a conversation about the movie. So Professor Edelman, if you would begin.
Well, thank you, Antonia. It's, in one sense, very hard to have this panel after watching the film, because the film says a lot and is powerful and effective. Also, I hope we will be, so stop me if I go too long, but it's really a conversation that I think we ought to have. Bob Reich's explanation for why we have so much inequality in the country, I think, is quite thorough, everybody that it reaches is learning something very important about where we are right now. It isn't something that happened yesterday, it shows you how really out of kilter or totally misleading so much of the politics that we have today. It's just what is being said by so many elected leaders and others just doesn't square with the facts. There are a couple things that are sort of missing in the film that essentially are a challenge to all of us to fill in. One is that for all of its power, and this is a concern that I have well beyond the film, when we hear about the 1% and the 99%, and that certainly brought the inequality very much into the national consciousness, it tends not to go all the way to the bottom of the 99%. The film tells us, obviously, how so many people lost out, the kind of hollowing out of the middle class, how many people end up struggling, and the implication is there that there's a lot of poverty at the bottom. But that's not the game that he's after. So I'm not so critical about that. But just to remind ourselves, and so. I think that's the kind of place where, given the concerns and the interest and the work that all of us do, and I suspect that a lot of you do, or you wouldn't be here, is to get people to focus on those who are struggling at the very, very bottom. This is a big year. Everybody already knows, it's the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. and Paul Ryan and others, but he's kind of the leading edge of it, want to tell us that everything failed, that the war on poverty was a total failure, and his position is we have to start over. He really does want to do something about poverty. It's just that the suggestions are warmed over stuff that didn't make any sense in the first place, and I won't to this group unless you want to hear the whole, although I suspect we could do a responsive reading on it. It needs a public answer, and so we need to be prepared with the facts. Number one, in the 1960s on into the early 1970s, we cut poverty in half in this country, from 22% to 11%. We cut African American poverty from 55% to 31% during that period of time. Part of that is because the economy, perhaps the greatest part of it, is because the economy was very strong, the post-World War II economy overall, with some recessions, but overall. It's a result of civil rights, because the civil rights movement, when you look at those numbers about black poverty, it's very much a result of the building of a middle class that's partly in the industrial heartland, but it's partly in cities that many cities began to hire people of color, and that was a result of organizing that was in turn connected to the civil rights movement and to community action in the war on poverty as well. And so we need to point that out. We need to say that we have policy successes, that we would have right now twice as many people who are poor, according to the rather anemic measure of poverty that we have, but we would have something on the order of 90+ million people poor, instead of the 46 million according to the count that we have. That's half of that is Social Security, but it's other public policies. It's the earned income tax credit, it's food stamps, it's the child tax credit, it's housing vouchers. It's quite a long list of things, and we need to say that these aren't failed policies; they're successful. Medicaid is successful, and if you just all you have to do is look at infant mortality numbers over the course of the last 50 years, and that tells you that. I mean, I went to Mississippi with Robert Kennedy, as Antonia mentioned, in 1967 with Robert Kennedy, and we saw kids who down there who had swollen bellies and sores on their arms and legs that would not heal in this rich country. Well, we've done something about that. With all the poverty, we don't have that kind of extreme malnutrition in our country now. And of course, the success of Social Security, long list of public policies that work. Okay, but still, 46 million people poor, and important to understand, as Bob Reich said in the film, at the end of the 20th century, poverty was down to the same level almost as it was in 1973, which was our lowest number, 11.1% in 1973, 11.3% when Bill Clinton left office. So that was holding our own in the face of all those things that he showed in the film. In the face of globalization, in the face of the flood of low-wage jobs that we have, all of the things that took place over that period of time that we didn't contemplate back in 1968 when Robert Kennedy died, when Lyndon Johnson left office. And so the question we have to ask ourselves now, well, first of all, after 2000, 15 million more people poor just over the last 13, 14 years. Most of that in the recession, a big chunk of it under George W. Bush. So the problems that we have now are considerably worse. And we should really be clear in saying that we did a lot, it made a lot of sense, and that we've been fighting against some trends in a variety of ways, not just economic, what happened to the education of low-income children in this country, what happened to family structure, what happened to mass incarceration, a whole list of things. And so that's kind of I would say, the challenge. Bob Reich said in the movie there are a lot of answers. We could all go on at length about that. The main thing that I want to say is one that I think is absolutely, to this group, needs not to be said, is we need a better politics. There has to be all of the effort that there can be to build stronger communities. There needs to be leadership in neighborhoods and in communities, which is civic and not necessarily political. All true. But fundamentally, we're not going to make progress on all of these things unless we have a better politics. And that means, as he said in the film, people need to be involved in organizing. They need to be active. They need to be out there. The power that we have is people power. That's the only answer, particularly as long as we have Citizens United. That's really, but it's always been true that what's on our side is people power.
Thank you. We are going to move right along to Patty Fugere, and for a few words, and then we're going to come down the line and then open it up at the end for those who missed the initial format discussion.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. When Antonia introduced me, she described me as being to the far right, which words have never been associated with me before. But thank you, I guess. So I think I was invited to the panel to give a little bit of a DC local perspective and I want to paint a picture for you of what we're talking about here in the District of Columbia when we're talking about this kind of inequality and poverty. So I'm going to toss out a couple of numbers to you, but I won't inundate you. So in the District of Columbia, the top 5% of DC households, the average income is 54 times the income of the bottom 20% of district residents. That's the fourth highest income inequality gap in the country. The average income for the DC's top 5% of households is now over $500,000, while the average income of the bottom fifth is just $9,900. And compare that with what the basic family budget is for DC for a single parent with 2 children, which would be an annual income of $85,000. So the bottom 20% of DC residents are earning just about 12% of what they need to really make it in a city like DC with the extraordinary costs that we have. Our housing is, I'm sure you know, especially if you're renting housing here in DC, it's astronomical. Folks who are in poverty have very little chance of being able to afford housing in the private market. We've lost over half of our low-cost housing stock in the last decade or so, and that has left over 70,000 households in DC on waiting lists for subsidized housing. So those who are on the list, who are struggling to pay their rents, if they're minimum wage earners, they have to work more than 3 full-time jobs to make that rent affordable. So we talk about we need a better politics and engagement in politics, and how do you find the time to participate in the public discourse when all you're doing is working, right? But what I want to, I guess the one thing that I just really want to emphasize is the inequality in terms of access to power in the district. And that's my experiences here in DC. And the importance of trying to correct for that, and the role that we who are advocates for justice can play in correcting for that. I think it's really important that we not ever look at ourselves as being voices for the voiceless. I have never met a client who lacked a voice. Mm-hmm. I've met many people who have lacked folks who will listen to them, and what we can do as advocates is to craft opportunities and provide support for people to become their own spokespeople, to tell their own stories. It doesn't have to be brokered through us. And I think it's such a critical piece of moving out of poverty. Not only will there be an opportunity to impact the policies that are crafted and the opportunities, and to have a say in what the budgets are going to look like, how public funding is allocated. But the fact of participation itself is such a key part of moving out of poverty. And I want to pass this microphone on in just a second and end with some language that I wept at, literally, the first time I read it. And it was related to the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And the special rapporteur on persons living in extreme poverty was doing a survey of nations about the participation of those in poverty in the public discourse. And in introducing that survey, this language was used. Participation is an affirmation of the right of every individual and group to take part in the conduct of public affairs, but also a part of the solution to poverty and social exclusion. Anti-poverty and development policies are more likely to be effective, sustainable, inclusive, and equitable if they are the result of participatory processes. Participatory methods are important tools for empowerment, accountability, and ending the cycle of deprivation and dependency in favor of the autonomy and social inclusion of persons living in poverty. And I think until we get to that point where we have truly participatory decision-making, we're going to continue to see the kinds of gaps that Bob Reich spoke so eloquently about in the film.
Wonderful. Joe?
Well, thank you. First, I want to say what an honor it is to be part of this panel. And following Peter and Patty, I'd like to underline just for a minute the whole question of poverty as opposed to inequality, which both Peter and Patty spoke to. As Peter said, you know, we're now at the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. And I think it's really interesting to note and important to grapple with the way that our discourse has shifted in 50 years around dealing with massive inequalities. Some existed, you know, 50 years ago, but they were different, I think, from the kind that Robert Reich talks about in this film. 50 years ago, when Michael Harrington published The Other America, and when Lyndon Johnson talked about the Great Society, there was an assumption that some people were excluded from a dream that was working for the vast majority. And one thing I think becomes clear in this film is that that assumption isn't really that tenable anymore, that what's happening in the middle is a deep illness. And I think that one of the great things about this film is that it shines a spotlight on that middle. You know, and at one point he talks about focusing on people with within 50% of the median income, either below, above or below, and focusing in on that group and how they were impacted by the processes that he describes here. I think that's very important for us to do. But I think as we do that, we shouldn't lose sight of what, you know, Peter and Patty have talked about, that what has happened to that middle group and addressing that problem is not necessarily the same as addressing what is happening to the poor. That what's happening to that group and what's happening to the poor, I think, are interconnected, but maybe require different vocabularies and different lenses to look through to actually see what's going on in some ways. And in other ways, I think there is a commonality across the economy from the poor to those in the middle. But one thing I'd like to hear from all of you about is how you think we can talk about inequality and address it, but do it in a mindful way that also keeps in mind that the poor, and addressing their problems, especially the problems of really the working poor also, that requires maybe a special discussion of its own. As I listened to the film and watched it, I thought about especially two other arenas that we should think about. regarding the implications of this film. Peter alluded to politics and Citizens United, and I think that's an important one. I would separate out from that another one that's related, and that is government or the state. One of the profound things that's happened over the past 50 years is that I think we lived through a massive discrediting of government. And it's hard to imagine getting to where we're at right now without that process having happened. I think that was integral to getting us where we are. So how can we address this problem that the state really needs to be re-legitimized as a vehicle to try to, create policies that work for the many, as well as addressing the problems of those who are really in the most suffering. The second area I think we need to think about is the workplace and what happens there. And the film does a little bit with that, but to my mind, I don't think enough. The workplace has changed radically in what it represents, it seems to me, in America in the last 50 years. I'm a historian, and historians sometimes talk about the passing of the era of Fordism. The idea that there was a time in the middle 20th century when the economy was built around large manufacturing, and when the employer had an interest in reducing the turnover of a workforce and developing a real relationship there. And in part, that relationship could be built up and strengthened through a process like collective bargaining. But it's a profound movement to go from the middle 20th century's prototypical employer being General Motors to today's employer being Walmart. And the vastly different ways that those companies do business and are organized, and the vastly different relationship of the worker in the workplace to the employer. An assembly line in 1964 when the war on poverty was being announced, and what that represented and what it meant to be on that assembly line then, as opposed to being a Walmart associate today and what that represents. It seems to me that a lot more discussion of the workplace might be in order. And one final just observation about this film is that I think the film is really encouraging in a lot of ways. He's a great popularizer, and he helps get discussions going, and the fact that you all are still here at this hour at night is testimony to that. But I think Robert Reich himself is part of this story in a certain way, and that is that he's changed over time in ways that I think are worth us thinking about. I don't remember him at the time when Peter was in the Clinton administration being as focused on issues of inequality as he is now. Right. And then he was talking a lot about the need for education and training and things like that. And it seems like now he's starting to understand that those things, while important, are not going to solve the problems of power disparity and growing, exploitation. They're not really going to solve the problem of the Walmart associate. And, he wasn't really that critical of NAFTA that I can recall. Now he's against fast track of the new trade agreement in the Pacific. And I have to say, I don't begrudge him any of that. I'm glad he's moved in those ways. And I think that that's indicative of something important that I hope we can see more of. And I think people like Peter was a prophet, I think, when he stood up in the Clinton years and basically, said that this form of neoliberalism that you're trying to visit upon the poor is going to make matters worse. And I think that we see in Robert Reich now, I think, a movement that I just hope we can encourage among, other liberals today and progressives.
Good.
Wonderful. Anthony?
I found this to be a very moving documentary as well, and I'm hopeful that it, along with the efforts of many academics and individuals who are activists in communities will begin to facilitate a different kind of discourse about wealth, income, social inequality and stratification, as well as, the least of these, those who are stuck and mired in poverty. We very desperately need that kind of discourse, but more importantly, as Peter alluded to, we need organic intellectuals and people who are on the ground engaged in these efforts and this movement. I grew up in the Mississippi that Peter and his wife visited back in the 60s. Grew up as a very, very poor kid in a small country town called Magnolia, Mississippi, population 2,000. It was almost a national holiday when we got our first traffic light. And during this period of time, when I was coming of age in the 70s, there were a number of programs in the 60s and 70s. There was a number of programs that served as a bridge, as it were, from the kind of abject poverty that I was accustomed to in the rural South to the possibilities and the dream of America. Those bridges often consisted of government programs like Head Start or like the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, CETA, that gave individuals like myself jobs at a very early age that permitted us to provide supplemental income for struggling families, so forth and so on. I often tease my kids. I've got 4 boys. I show them the information that periodically comes from the Social Security Administration, I guess, saying when taxes were first withheld. And I say, look at that date. How old was your dad when the government started taking taxes from him? And they do the numbers. You were 13? 13, yes. That was my first job, actually having taxes withdrawn. Work started long before the age of 13. But it just goes to show you that there was something in place at that time that allowed for that bridge. And there were a number of programs, that benefited people who were poor, whether it was Pell Grants and a real commitment to making the transition from poverty to educational opportunities that provide some of the reasons why I was able to make the transition from that impoverished small town area to Princeton, New Jersey, and then to Yale and to Harvard and to Georgetown. And I'm very fearful as well that, over the course of the decades, we have created a construction of the liberal welfare state as something to be thought of as evil, as an albatross around our necks that we need to almost a kind of devil that we need to exercise ourselves of in order to be the pure kind of untainted understanding and vision of America that some would hold dear. And yet the America that I know that was of such a help to so many people trying to deal with the adversity and the burdens of poverty was an America of greater kindness and of concern and of community building and organization that understood the importance of cohesive communities, right? I often tell my kids the story of coming home from school one day after having done something outlandishly mannish in my classroom related to my very fine and beautiful second grade teacher that I won't recount the story of. But at any rate, this teacher happened to be the daughter of my mother's sister's best friend. So by the time I get back home, the teacher has told her mother, who has called and told my mother what I did, who is, of course, waiting for me as I step off the school bus, switch in hand, prepared to explain to me why these kinds of antics cannot continue. And she did a quite convincing job. And by the time I went to church on Sunday, the pastor was in place and he had heard the story as well. And he says, "Little cook, I heard about what you did in school. You better not do that again. I'm going to be watching you." Community was cohesive, you see. Community was intact. And we have allowed so many processes of gentrification and destruction of community on so many levels that does not make possible that kind of cohesiveness, which is important as infrastructure for building, you know, a future and providing those bridges. It's very important, I think, that we get back to that. The state was a very much important part of that, yes, but also, you know, within the civil society and civil sphere, individuals having a real and profound understanding of community and caring and what it meant to be there for each other was very important as well. I'd like to just talk just very briefly about the ways in which the attack against those who are poor and against those who are increasingly marginalized in a globalized society is part of an ideological construction of neoconservatism and part of the neoliberalism that I put in that category that Peter had to deal with when he was in office. It's not by accident that Ronald Reagan opens his campaign in 1980 in my home state of Mississippi, in Neshoba County, at the site of the slain civil rights workers, right? And a speech that resonates with tones of, you know, state sovereignty and states' rights and, you know, respecting the heritage of the South. He was sending clear messages to that region with regard to what the Republican Party was going to stand for in this reaction to, this backlash to the civil rights movement and some of the progressive economic legislation that I believe had put the country on the right track. Lee Atwater, as many of you know from a speech that he made in the early 80s, signaled what the new Southern strategy was going to be about. And for those of you who haven't heard it, I just got to read just a bit of it, okay? So, because I think it's so important to this debate. He says, it has become, for liberals and leftists, enraged by the way Republicans never suffer the consequences for turning electoral politics into a cesspool, a kind of a smoking gun. He says, you start out in 1954 by saying, nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger anymore. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this. Is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than saying nigger, nigger. Now the same indefatigable research who brought the Mitt Romney's 47% remarks, well, that's going on to the commentary. But my point here is that one has to look very closely at the ways in which race and other ideological identities have been used as a wedge to divide and conquer, right? Sometimes it's been very difficult to talk about advancing policies that have to do with poverty because many whites, the last thing that they want to be is constructed as black poor. When you're able to identify poverty with minorities and you're able to construct minorities as inferior, the difficulties of getting then whites to identify with those groups for purposes of challenging a common evil becomes very, very problematic. Now, I wonder whether or not, given the increasing social inequality and stratification that is appearing on the scene, where the middle class is dwindling, do we have an opportunity in this to launch a critique that gets beyond the divide and conquer mechanisms of neoconservatives and that conservatives have used for such a long period of time? Are we at a point where it's bad enough for enough people that we can start talking about interventions, progressive interventions, that are not themselves corralled, sequestered, and choked off by the ideological construction of those interventions as pro-black, pro-Hispanic, pro-minority, whatever it is, right? That's my hope, that we are moving into a period of time where we can have these honest and candid discussions that are not subjected to this kind of vitriol and this kind of systematic undermining. We'll see.
I hope so. Thank you. That was actually an excellent segue into what I wanted to talk about, which is issues of housing inequality and housing instability in our society, which are caused by a great many factors, but gentrification and other forms of inequality certainly are a big part of it. When I first watched the film, I was struck actually by that image of the suspension bridge and the period of income equality or nearly income equality between the two posts of the bridge. And that's essentially the post-World War II period leading up to the start of the Reagan administration. And what really struck me about that is, there was the big word equality posted on the screen in the film. But what struck me is actually that might have been a period of income equality, but that was not a period of equality or societal equality. Until we got to the period that Peter mentioned, sort of the late 60s and into the 70s, when poverty really started to reduce. We know that there was a great deal of societal inequality before that point, and frankly after that point as well, that affected a great number of really critical basic necessities for people, housing being one of the most critical. And if you think about the root or the foundation from which people can grow either their families or their interest in organizing or their involvement in politics, that all starts with a home. Well, of course, we were lucky in 1968 to have the passage of the Fair Housing Act, which responded to a major and continuing, unfortunately, but major injustice in the inequality in the distribution of housing in our society. And I wanted to focus on housing for my points because I didn't want anyone to leave this session and think that if we raise the minimum wage and we improve the atmosphere for workers in the country, that we have solved everything. We won't have solved everything. In fact, yes, raising the minimum wage certainly may make housing more affordable as long as the price of housing remains where it is today. Indeed, raising the minimum wage to the figures talked about today, to $10.10 an hour or whatever, will make some housing affordable to people, but as Patty said, the average rent in Washington, D.C. is actually 3 times the minimum wage. So raising it to $10.10 an hour is not going to suddenly lead to massive reductions in homelessness. We have to actually look at some alternatives that have to do with controlling a different market, not the labor market, but the housing market. To that point, I wanted to just share a little bit of history about housing and past efforts to provide housing and control the housing market. I share this list, and I've shared it with other students up in Baltimore. And I started providing this list actually when I had the opportunity to have a debate with a very intelligent law firm partner in Baltimore who represents affordable housing developers. And we were talking about the tremendous homelessness and poverty that we have in society today. And he said to me, the problem was, and the reason we have so much homelessness is not the lack of affordable housing or the lack of sufficient incomes, but it's the inability of communities to take care of their own, and the deinstitutionalization of the mental health system, which is a common misconception. And so I started to go back and look at the history of affordable housing investment in the country, and I think it's really quite telling. So of course we think of the 1930s as the Great Depression period, and there were at least five major pieces of legislation that placed great investment in affordable housing in this country. It started in 1932 with low-income housing investment through something called the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, and culminated in 1937 with the United States Housing Act, which was a tremendous, tremendous piece of legislation that led to, frankly, a $500 million investment at the time, and if you did that in today's figures, that would be $8.1 billion of investment in housing. And this was housing not just for the middle class, this was housing for all income levels. And it led to the creation of site-based Section 8 housing. It provided a great investment for other forms of affordable housing that carried the generations through into the 1940s. And of course, in 1949, we have a Housing Act of that year, which President Truman signed, that has really the great and tremendous goal of making sure that we have a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family. And that was the goal up until the Clinton administration, actually. The goal was to provide housing for every American family, whether that was embraced by the president's administrations or not. And that goal was actually eliminated in the Quality Work and Responsibility Act that was signed during the Clinton administration. And we have, even frankly before his administration, seen a steady decline in the provision of affordable housing ever since then. Certainly in 1974, there was the creation of the Section 8 voucher program, where folks can take pieces of paper to the private market and try to rent apartments. And we know that that is a critical resource, and yet in many communities that don't have adequate protections for voucher holders inevitably find themselves taking those vouchers and living in communities of extreme poverty because there's nowhere else to take those vouchers, because either the rents are too high or the landlords do not want to accept vouchers because they don't want people who come from poverty living in their communities. And that comes up to today, where we know that the federal government is actually interested in starting to privatize public housing, which for so long had been a pure government owned enterprise. In Baltimore City, we will see the privatization of over 20 public housing properties over the next 2 years because the Housing Authority is utilizing a demonstration program from the federal government to turn those properties over. That's in a city in Baltimore where we have actually already lost 46% of the supply of public housing that existed 15 years ago. We've lost 46%. And so I said to my esteemed colleague, this law firm partner, who was claiming that it's families who don't take care of their family members, or it was the deinstitutionalization of the mental health system, I said, how can you possibly say that the reason we have homelessness today is for some other reason than the fact that we keep knocking down housing? Because if you have a home, then you're not homeless, right? So if we keep eliminating the supply of housing for everyone, and frankly, this is either for those who are extremely low income or folks who are in the so-called middle class, as was used in this film, we will continue to see this terrible result of poverty, which is this inability to retain a home. And I was so glad that the producers of the film chose to share the story of the family who lost their home, their condo, when their husband lost their job, and they were luckily taken in by another family that was very generous. But that story of homelessness is frankly all too common. And we really lack sufficient controls in our communities to ensure that we have affordable housing for everyone. So with that history, I went on the website for this film, and I encourage you all to do that. It's called inequalityforall.com or something. And there are action steps that they recommend that people take. One of them is raise the minimum wage. There are others about going after Wall Street, et cetera. Not one of those action steps actually has to do with advocating for housing equality or housing stability. Not one of those has to do with form a tenant association. And I was so glad when I lived and worked here in DC, there's some tremendous tenant associations here that work so hard to save their buildings and did a tremendous job doing that. That is a critical part of this, because of course the housing market in and of itself is its own market, and I don't need to tell you that. You all watched the foreclosure crisis happen. That was the housing market doing what it will do. So types of solutions to this may include things like certainly government investment in affordable housing is critical, and you can certainly advocate for that. There are concepts about inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing, which we have in some form here in DC, and we have in an even worse form in Baltimore. That's essentially where you require new developers to set aside a certain percentage of units to folks of lower income than those who would be able to afford the other units in the building. There are concepts of rent control or rent stabilization that can control the market a little bit. In Maryland, we don't have any of that except in Tacoma Park, which is one of the reasons that Maryland, and this was released today at 2 o'clock today, Maryland is the 4th least affordable state in the country. It's one of the wealthiest states, but it's the 4th least affordable state, with very few controls and very few programs to ensure that new development is made available to people with very, very low incomes. So this is only to say that in addition to all of the wonderful action steps provided on the website on this film that I encourage you to look at, that we absolutely must look at housing stability and controls for the housing market to ensure that people have an equal opportunity to engage in their lives in whatever way they choose. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. And as you're thinking of your excellent questions, I do want to share that right at the end of our question and answer period, someone's going to tell me how much more time we have for the program. But right at the end of the question and answer period, we have our colleague, Richard Taylor from the program Operation Hunger DC, who's going to share a little bit about his program and some opportunities for student participation and faculty participation in that program, which is just a few blocks away. So he's right over here, and when we get done, I'll turn the mic over to him. We are ending at 4? 40 minutes, okay, great. So I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Mm-hmm.
In the sort of the wake of our recent recession, there were a lot of measures taken to assist the people that were hurt, keep them from falling into poverty, from losing their houses, keep food on the table. And it's difficult to argue this without seeming completely evil. But it's not the word you want to say after that. But we also see a lack of outrage over the current state of things. You can see that with Occupy and how it was so easily marginalized, portrayed as a fringe. Is it the actions they're taking to keep people out of poverty, to keep everything sort of okay, sort of acting as a fourth coping mechanism after the three that were discussed in the film? Is that preventing perhaps sufficient outrage to overcome the very entrenched interests that keep anything from changing?
I'll respond to that really quickly, just with a historical analogy. You know, I teach a class on the Great Depression to students, and you know, one of the things that I think is hard for them to immediately understand is when unemployment was 25% in 1932, that there wasn't more unrest in the country than there was, and that actually unrest grew when things started to get better, and when the New Deal promised that it would really improve things, and it's not till 1934 and 35 that you really start to see a large number of strikes and labor militancy growing. And when I taught the course last, you know, it was just a year ago, so I could talk to the students about the recent Great Recession, and you know, ask them the question that you pose, like why isn't there more outrage? Why did Occupy, you know, just, you know, erupt and then vanish, seemingly? And I think, you know, the discussion led to a lot of interesting observations, but I think one of the more pertinent was that I think you would see more outrage if people knew and had a sense of what could be done, right? I think that there's a sense of disempowerment people feel right now. And I think the New Deal conveyed, I think, a better sense than was recently conveyed in something being transformed, that when we come out of this, it's all going to be different. And I think that that was an empowering feeling for people. But I would say that, you know, the Rooseveltian response to the New Deal, that was 30 years in the making, right? And if the Great Depression had happened in 1917 or 18, I think it might have produced really different outcomes. I think part of what we're grappling with right now at this point in history is that I don't think that we were ready with policy responses to what happened in 2008. I don't think we were ready enough to deal with the problems that this film describes. Just to take one thing, something that came out of the Great Depression, the minimum wage, enacted in 1938. You've heard recently people say, how could you raise the minimum wage at a time when we're trying to grow out of this bad economy? Well, they did it then. But we're still, I think, trapped in ways of thinking about the minimum wage that go back, you know, in time, and that we really need to thoroughly revamp. Now we talk about a 10-10 minimum wage. I think that would be great. But unless we can index the minimum wage to productivity going forward, I don't know what kind of minimum wage increase is going to have a significant impact for long. The real problem is that wealth is being created in this country by the work of people who are becoming more productive over time, but they're not sharing the gains of the productivity. Unless we can fix that, you know, I don't see how we get out of this. But my answer to your question would be that I think right now people are, you know, are lacking a strong sense of, yes, if we do this, it will be better. And I think lacking that sense, the outrage people feel is really transformed in their minds to fear and insecurity.
I don't disagree with any of that, but I do want to provide you with a little bit of hope. I do see the Occupy movement as not a movement in and of itself, but as the beginning of something that will happen over time for sure. And I want to share with you just a little bit of what the outgrowth has been in Baltimore. One of the factions within Occupy Baltimore was a group that was focused on the concept of a right to housing. And for those of you who study human rights law, you may know that the concept of a right to housing, well, it certainly comes from many places, but one of them is the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights. And that was actually signed by President Carter, not ratified, but signed by President Carter, and we thank him for that. But this group started organizing around that. And this is grassroots organizing in the purest sense. It was an idea. They didn't have some former leader that came in and told them how to do it. They decided it for themselves and began working in a few neighborhoods in Baltimore. Baltimore, at this point, during the Occupy movement, really had no tenant organizing. The only tenant organizing it had prior to that was organizing done by Acorn. And we all know what happened to Acorn. So there really wasn't any. And they started organizing. And they realized that in one of the neighborhoods, the city actually had a master plan for ultimately demolishing all of the affordable housing in that community. Unfortunately, not an unusual plan, but they discovered it, and they started organizing the residents. And they found out a lot of things that happened sort of in the pre-gentrification years. They found that landlords were doing what I like to call bad behavior. They were coming up with phony fees for tenants so they could start to get tenants out of the building quick when the market looked like they would be able to get those tenants out and convert those buildings either to higher rent or to condos. We saw a lot of that in DC. And so they started organizing those tenants. Well, now, just last month, they filed their first suit against those landlords. And I will tell you, it came at great surprise to everybody. It's been a long time in Baltimore since someone filed a suit against a private landlord for their bad behavior. And that suit is part of this broader organizing effort in this particular neighborhood. And my favorite moment was when my particular organization's not involved in the suit, but someone sent me an email and they said, "Is this suit for real?" And I said, "You better believe it." And there's more coming. So I think that there are, while Occupy itself and that sort of big burst of energy itself started to wane, some very exciting things are happening, and I don't think Baltimore is alone in sort of developing some things that were very lacking in the community, tenant organizing, enforcement of rights, et cetera, that I think ultimately will build up. And the communities, the philanthropic communities and others are going to start to stand behind those entities and give them the strength that they need to keep going.
I would say that, sustained outrage is often a function of, intense and prolonged organization within communities, and a lot of the stuff that you simply, don't see and don't observe until it manifests itself in that kind of sustained, organized outrage. The progressive movement was a precursor to all that happened in the New Deal, and so the stuff that you have happening with Jane Addams and the Whole House movement, with the socialists and the communists in cells and organizations trying to resist the various seditious acts and the legislation being passed by Congress, the NAACP with the Niagara movement in the early 20th century. All this stuff was building, right? But one of the things that concerns me about the question that you asked is that in most social movements in America, those social movements were very much directed by, influenced by an intelligentsia within that movement. And I know that there's a lot of critical theory associated with participatory movements versus the elites within movements. And I'm not saying that elites should run movements. I believe in the SNCC model that should be more participatory, so forth and so on. But nevertheless, when there are forces that kind of divide and conquer, separate out that intelligentsia from the masses, it becomes problematic and more difficult for those masses to organize over a sustained period of time. Why? Because poor people are trying to make ends meet on a daily basis, 2, 3 jobs. They're trying to hold down. Sometimes they just don't simply have the leisure and the flexibility to sustain the organization of movement. So I get very concerned when I see movement leaders being bought out in organizations in a way that leaves the masses of those movements to fend for themselves. Which is why I think some of the more modern theories of social movement always focus on how to develop organizations that are sustainable over a period of time, to train and educate leaders within the organization so that you are always replenishing yourself, as opposed to developing an elite group who may be bought off, who may leave, so forth and so on, and leave the movement in straits. That becomes, I think, extraordinarily important to this, the sustainability of social movements. And the other thing with social movements, I think, is that those leaders have to think about themselves in different ways, right? Not in bringing the holy grail of the gospel to the movement, but really, as you said earlier, listening to movement participants and being engaged in a dialectical process in which the movement is allowed to grow and to develop based on the indigenous participation of the masses and individuals within those movements. When that can happen and be sustained over a period of time, then outrage can become more organized and more sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Hi, my name is Betty, and I'm a former resident of Washington, D.C., and I worked with tenants for years and years and years, and worked with these two young ladies who are on the panel. We got through things like we worked in inclusionary zoning, housing production trust fund, so that we could build affordable housing. My problem with all that work and that energy is something that you mentioned, is how do you not leave behind the masses? Because it becomes a very heady process. These people are enthusiastic, they're trying to survive, their day-to-day survival, and yet you need to have skills to fight the different boards and the different forces that are out there, and having a coming together of the minds. You, Ms. Anthony,
Yes.
You said you were in Princeton University?
Right.
I'm from Princeton, and I'm going to let you know what's happening in Princeton right now. The 60s was a time when the liberal folks of Princeton fought very hard for the rights of black folks. Now, last year, what the county has done, we had a community of black people in Princeton that lived basically between 2 streets, John Street and Lewisman Street. Okay. Yep. First, the university's taken over. All that area to the west of John Street, where those housing for the students was, do you remember?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. They've taken over that entire area, so we have the university to work with that we had to fight. Not only that, we also have what the county is doing. DC doesn't have a county, it's just a city-state. The county has increased the tax rates so high that it's forcing the entire black community to leave. And so it's not that you just need to have all the feel-good kinds of things going on. That's important because that regenerates you. What you need to do is to have people who are willing to learn what's going on, stick together, fight, build a program that's sustainable. Your job is not done when you accomplish one thing.
Right.
Because there's always coming after you. There's always something else that's in the mix. And just like the inclusionary zoning, we fought for years for that. The idea of inclusionary zoning began in 1980. What year did we get inclusionary zoning?
I want to say it was 05, was it?
2005?
Something like that.
2005. And then we fought hard, organizations across the city, and what did we get? 10% set-asides for affordable housing, 12% set-asides out of the entire project. Think of 100 units, and you get 10 affordable units, and they've wiped out all the affordable housing in 3 or 4 block radius. So the thing is, it's not just housing, but housing, you can't do anything unless you have a comfortable place to sleep. You can't send your children to school. You can't go to work. Your mind cannot be at ease. So my idea is this: they're always coming after you. If you think you have one thing to accomplish, the next thing comes after you, and it's not a restful thing. The third thing I guess I want to say is, how do you encourage other people to follow you, to learn and to expand and take you to places that you had not thought about? Inclusionary zoning and housing production trust fund was the brainchild of Dave Clark. Dave Clark was a city council person in the District of Columbia, a brilliant man in the 80s, the 70s. But we did not get these things until 25, 30 years later. So it's not just getting together and organizing and coming up with great ideas. It's a matter of learning how to work with the system, get what you want to have, and hold on to it, and then grow from there.
Betty, I'm so glad you're here. It's nice to see you again.
I came because of you guys.
Oh.
I knew it'd be magnificent with this panel.
That's great. Would someone like to respond to that?
Well, maybe we should hear everybody's questions, and then we could sort of answer all of them.
Sure.
Well, my question is this. I'm on the board of Jubilee Housing, which has about 8 apartment buildings for moderate, affordable housing, low-income housing. And I run a program called Jubilee Jobs that helps people get into the job market. This morning we had about 3 times as many people in our meeting as are here in this meeting that were looking for jobs, about 88, 90 people, and that's what we normally have every time we have orientation. Everything that has been said, I want to say yes to in a way. But the deeper question that I have is this, that I think that unless we really focus on what it is to be human and to look at the soul issues of a community, and to know that, I don't remember the quote exactly, but Martin Luther King said something to the effect that if we don't work together, we will all perish together. And I think that we are in that situation, so that it's not just that the poor or the rich, but it's that somehow we've got to come together for the totality so that we really are a community. And I think about in Washington, 1 in 3 children live in poverty. And I think that if our hearts in this room, I don't know if there's anybody who has a child who lives in poverty, but if our hearts aren't broken about every 3rd child that you see on the street who does not have basic food and shelter and education and the things that you need to grow up, something is wrong. We should have a broken heart. So my question is this: what is Georgetown as a Jesuit university and as a university that has a belief in compassion and a belief of preferential option for the poor? I think that is what the Jesuit philosophy and theology and Catholic theology is, that what do we do in order to deepen that and call that forth in this community, namely the university community, so that it can then begin to spread in a larger community? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think that for me, that's the deeper question. We need to do all the things that have been talked about, but we have a much deeper question that I think is before us.
Do you want to talk about it? Well, Terry, hi. I just will say for the Law Center, and Anthony can talk about that as well, and Joe, of course, can talk more about the overall university, but I think all of us anywhere can be doing more. The Law Center has a long commitment to working in a variety of ways in the community through our clinics primarily, and then what a lot of us do as individuals and what our students do. I've been so moved by, in recent years, just seeing the constant increase in the number of things that people do, both in terms of things that they do as part of their education, going out and working in communities with legal services organizations and other things, pro bono work that they do, the work that they did after Katrina, and there's a continuing steady group of people who go, different students every year down to New Orleans. Still, there's a long, long list of things. I consider myself, I hope not in some exaggerated way, I hope that what I'm really committed to is turning out a next generation of not just public interest lawyers, but lawyers who will be committed precisely to work toward ending poverty in our country. And I think it's fair to say that we have that commitment in the Law Center, and it's very much drawn from or influenced by the Jesuit tradition here. It connects to my own religious values, and I've always felt just very deeply connected to the Jesuit tradition here.
I have recently started to feel connected to the Jesuit tradition. It's taken a long, long while. I remember when I first came here 20 years ago, I understood that the law school had a commitment through its clinics to helping indigent populations. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to come here. But it seemed to me to be cut off from the ethos and culture of the school in general and the university in general. And I can distinctly remember having a conversation with the president of the university about the need for Georgetown in an area like DC before all the gentrification started, where there's still abject pockets of poverty here in DC, but it was even more pervasive back in the late 80s, early 90s. And his response to me, well, we do have some projects in Fiji going on, and in a couple of remote, islands and places around the world. And I said, but what about here? I mean, here, a few steps from this place, a few miles from this place, people are hungry. They're going to bed hungry. They're eating one meal a day at best. They are suffering. And where is Georgetown's presence in this community as a Jesuit institution, supposedly committed to compassion and love and justice? And as he puffed on his cigar, there was basically no answer to that, right? So I've been very emboldened by the fact that over the past few years, the law school has taken the initiative and extending this ethic of care outside of the clinics to regular professors who have commitments. Because to be quite honest with you, given that void that I felt between the university and the community, and my heart and passion being with the community and people of suffering, I pretty much just decided to focus my attentions there. Through church work, through, through various organizations, ministerial alliances, trying to help where I could and to utilize the resources of the law school and the university as best I could to accomplish that. There have been some structural institutional changes over the past few years, one of which has been the advent of the practicum, experiential learning, whereby those of us who have certain commitments in the community now can bring our passions back into the university and can connect with students, so that in my practicum on social and business entrepreneurship and on community economic development, I have 15 students across the semester that I align with practitioners in the area who with myself supervise them to deliver a range of legal and business services to struggling organizations, one of which is Jubilee. You know, I've worked with Marty Millett and had a group of students working with the organization to try to figure out how to reorganize its subsidiaries, so forth and so on, so as to expand its mission. And we hope to kind of continue to work with them and work in other areas as well. We've worked with enterprise community partners. We worked with social entrepreneurs who are trying to engage in workforce job development training of poor and marginalized people and communities. You know, so that kind of stuff is going on more. But you know, I agree with you fully that institutions of higher learning, that it needs to be more rhetoric, it needs to be less rhetoric and more on the grounds practice and commitment to justice. And I hope to see this trend actually continue.
I think I was misspeaking or not speaking correctly, but I'm not so much critical. That's not my point is not to be critical. But my point is to look at the deeper opportunity that is present in this institution and to look more deeply into who we are as people. Hopefully, I think this is true, especially young people are asking lots of questions, and one of the reasons they come to the university is to ask those questions and explore all of that. And I just wonder if we are reaching enough so that people really see it's belonging to a totality that includes, it's got to include the rich, and it's got to include the poor, and it's got to include the middle class. Personally, I think the middle class has a major responsibility. I think we can't expect the poor to do what, as someone has said, they don't have time to do. They don't have time or energy in their lives. But that's another topic. But it has to do with how do we call that forth in the community and in the student body.
I didn't take it as a criticism. I just took it as a call for service, and I'm just saying I echo that and believe that we have vast resources at our disposal, the university like Georgetown and Princeton and other universities around the country, and we need to, I think, call upon those universities to more equitably distribute and redistribute those resources in the direction of poor and marginalized communities.
I can't speak for the university, although I'm a product of the university, so I like to think it's in me somehow. But one of the things that I have seen as a partner with many here in the law school is the commitment to, and I think this is part of the Jesuit tradition, the commitment not simply to charity or service, but the commitment to justice. And I think there are ample opportunities here where we see students who are doing the service piece. They're doing the charity work in their clinics, but they're also thinking about the policy implications. They're thinking about the bigger picture and having that commitment to the ideal of justice and not just simply be in service to the community, I think is something that's a pretty deeply held value here at the law school. But one thing that you mentioned that I want to say that I just wanted to respond to, you were talking about 1 out of 3 kids in the District of Columbia living in poverty, and you know, our hearts all need to break, or shame on us if our hearts don't break. And we've actually seen a move in, I think, in local decision making that has become so callous towards those who are living in poverty, where there's an idea of really blaming the victim. Folks are taking advantage, they are not taking initiative, and this is driving the way policy decisions are being made. And it's heartbreaking on a different level to see that kind of retrenchment from being a more compassionate community that I think at least at one point the District of Columbia was. So that's a negative factor that we're struggling to deal with right now.
I think we have time for one more question. Amy?
Discourse. And my question is, what steps can an individual lawyer take in that direction, as well as the organized bar?
Well, I think the organized bar is going to talk about political discourse appropriately in a totally nonpartisan way. And I also think that when we talk about access to justice, it needs content. I do worry, I will tell you, that as I go to events that are sponsored by the American Bar Association talking about equal justice, that there is I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, for sure, but there's a sense that there's more emphasis on the access than there is to the justice. That there's perhaps more of a commitment to procedural due process than there is to substance. That there is more of a emphasis, not misplaced, on making sure that people have lawyers. The work I do is on the civil side, and the Gideon and the criminal side presents a whole other very serious sets of challenges, just not what I work on. But to introduce into the equal justice conference that takes place every year, and to introduce into the discourse about access to justice the fact that the people who have no lawyers does extend well up into the middle class, but who are the most victimized by that are people who are low income, people who live in poverty. And I don't see the same commitment to challenge the laws and the underlying ways in which the law is administered substantively that I see on the procedural side. So that's a challenge that I would issue to the American Bar Association. As to others, I've probably already taken too much time. But I think that for lawyers, it's things that I can say at a level of generality, which are sort of easy to say. And that is really, in many ways, the same kind of thing. It's relatively easy to get a lawyer to go to landlord-tenant court and defend somebody who's about to be evicted, although even there, as you I'm sure know, only about 5% of the tenants who are about to be evicted have lawyers. So to get the other 95% represented would be an achievement in and of itself. But there isn't the same thoughtfulness and commitment to asking the next question, which is, why are there so many people who are about to be kicked out of their homes? And what can we as individual lawyers, who can we connect with in the community who are the advocates or even take the initiative to create the kinds of coalitions that would say to our city government, let alone our national government, but just our city government here, that we have a housing production trust fund, but it ought to be funded at a level of 3 or 4 or 5 times the level that it is right now. Individual lawyers could take an interest in that and allying with other people, not just by themselves, but allying with other people could make a difference.
That's perfect. In fact, yes. So for those of us who are still, I guess, a minority of voices within the American Bar Association who believe in changing the policies and not just putting boots on the ground, which folks often ask for, there is a website that has been developed, which is ambar.org/poverty, I think, which is going to be, as it gets up and running, an interactive forum to engage members of the American Bar Association to start to work on major policy initiatives. And if you all are interested in it, I encourage you to go to that particular site. The hope is over the course of the next year that we will have members of the American Bar Association talk about their experiences with a number of programs that the ABA has committed to saving and expanding, from the food stamp program to Head Start to housing programs, et cetera, and really begin to utilize the power within the ABA for good and for justice, and not just for perpetual pro bono work. So I encourage you to go to that site. Again, it's ambar.org/poverty. Also, if you're interested in the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, which helped to incubate that idea with the section on individual rights and responsibilities, the Commission itself has a Facebook page, and you can follow all the work of the Commission and its joint work with IR&R. And Antonia, do you have a Facebook page for IR&R as well? Yes, you can look for the section on individual rights and responsibilities on Facebook as well. In addition, there are some materials out, you may have seen them when you got food during the break, about the Commission and the section, and sort of the ongoing work to try to meet the ideals that Peter put forth so well. I want to give the last 5 minutes to our colleague Richard Taylor, and if you want to just come on up to the podium and talk a little bit about Operation Hunger DC.
Thank you for having me this evening. We're so glad to be with you. Welcome to the ground floor. We are the ground level. We feed 125 to 200 people a day right at this location here on 2nd and D. We also feed New York Avenue and Oakey Street. Now, I'll tell you, it's very difficult, but we have a band of strong volunteers, advisors, and staff members. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my senior legal advisor, Ms. Christina Bostic, 2010 graduate of Georgetown Law School. And my principal consultant, Rochelle T. Logan, she works for HRSA. She's a public health analyst who helps us put together our programs and make sure that we feed the homeless. Basically, how we've done this is a mixture of innovativeness and value engineering. It's kind of our belief that all of the issues of homelessness cannot really be solved by the public trust. Sometimes just a hardline innovativeness and ingenuity of the American spirit are sometimes the only things that can get us through these problems that we seem to, keep coming over and over and over again. And, surely homelessness has existed, a long time before, many rises and crashes in the markets. So it's something that's probably always going to exist. We started out serving about 9,000 peanut butter and jelly sandwich and bananas. We value engineered it to be less than $30 a day to feed 200 people. We did it through bulk. We got our peanut butter and jelly offline. We were able to make a deal with the Mexican fruit stand over by Gallaudet. They give us 150 bananas for $8. We were able to do so many different things to allow us to bring the cost down so that we could do 7-day-a-week service. We are the only group in the district that does 7-day-a-week service. Kind of through that process, we began to evolve. We began to do different meals. We began to do hot meals. We began to do different things to try to service the homeless and give them the best possible product that we could give them. Now we currently do, rice and beans and chicken. We do our vegetable kind of soup mix, and we still do the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. But the thing that has really kind of helped us become sustainable here over about the last 2 months is the partnerships that we've developed with Costco, Safeway, and Chipotle to do pickups and such that we don't have to spend our own money to feed the people. Now, you guys are going to get an opportunity tonight. No pressure, of course. We're going to walk down here, less than a 5-minute walk right here to 2nd and D, and we're going to feed the people until there's no more people who are hungry. Then we're going to walk right around to the women's shelter. We're going to do about 50 to 75 meals in the women's shelter. Then we're going to go into the men's shelter, and we're going to serve hot food in the men's shelter, usually about 35 to 60 meals. So it is kind of quite an experience, and we are definitely looking for volunteers and people. And I was so happy to hear you say, you guys, you're moral conscious and everything, because we need help. Our resources are limited. Everybody is pushed to the absolute limit. Everybody has jobs, professional jobs, government jobs. As I said, she's a public health analyst for HRSA. They keep her till 7, 8 o'clock, and I'm, asking her to write an email to a politician about something, about coming to feed the homeless with us. So we do need that help. We do need that advising. Christina has just been kind of a godsend to us, and helping us get some of our things together. And then we have, from a standpoint of how we do things day to day, the public expertise of Rochelle. Speaking of sustainability, I've done a lot of different things in my life, and I've had a strong will. I was in the NFL at a point in my life. I've been given a divine revelation that, I can connect the grocery stores, the food chains, and the restaurants like the Human Genome Project, because there's more food in this country that is thrown away than people to eat it. But our focus is not on, doing innovative ways to serve the homeless. Our focus is on what's the new iPhone, what's the new app, what's Silicon Valley. Our best thinkers are doing other things. And so to answer your question from earlier, I think the way that you get a movement now, you look to social media, you look to the Instagram, you look to the Facebook, you do grassroots efforts to try to get people organized in such a way to energize them as Reich was mentioning on the film, or Rice, I might have pronounced his name wrong. Those are kind of the ways that we do things. We go to churches. I'm constantly passing out cards for people to have opportunities. Everything is paid for. God has truly made us a way to keep feeding every day, and so it's kind of our duty to make sure the food gets out. I mean, there even has been times, even in the beginning when we started this process, where we had the food, but we didn't have our distribution methods correct, such that, food can go bad. Breads and muffins and things can go bad, and if you don't give it out according to certain schedules, it'll go bad and it'll go to waste. And so those are just kind of some of the issues that come with trying to feed the people. But I think that if we can get a system that we can connect these grocery stores and get rid of some of the corruption, because my minister, who actually helped me get some of the grocery stores, hit me to a game that's going on in these grocery stores, where some of these nonprofits who are collecting the food from the grocery stores are not serving it back to the homeless people. They're actually just redistributing it in corner stores, changing the expiration dates. And it's a huge hustle, huge game, claiming it on their tax returns as well, doubling back and making money on the sale of the products. Now, we actually give our food to the homeless because we feel like it's the right thing to do, and certainly that's our purpose and goal and mission. That's kind of our purpose, and that's what we do. There's an opportunity here tonight. We have all the food already ready. Everything's packaged up, ready to go. We will just walk straight out front. We'll walk to the left of this street right here on 2nd and D. It's approximately a 3-minute walk, and we will feed the people, and that is open to any of you guys who would like to participate. If you guys would like to get connected with us, you can go to www.operationhungerdc.org. There's a little place to fill in some information, and you can send us your contact information, and somebody on the staff will get back to you. You can also check us out on Instagram, Operation Hunger DC1. The Facebook, Operation Hunger DC. We have plenty of videos. You can see everything. We're on the street. Our primary purpose is to serve people who do not have shelter. To us, necessities are air, water, and food. Now, we would like to hope that everybody could have housing too, but we live in the reality of the situation, and we serve the very most basic of needs. So that's kind of the spiel. I don't want to take too much of your time. I know it's late. But if you guys have any questions, I could quickly answer any questions that you might have about the program. And you, like I said, you guys are more than welcome. We would love to have you come serve with us tonight.
Great. Okay, so that's it. And again, there are materials out up the stairs if you would like them. And I'm sure if you have any questions for the speakers, you can come up and ask them directly. Thank you very much, and really thank you, Katja Herring, for putting this together and for being such a gracious host. Thank you.
Right, very nice. Well done.
Very nice to meet you.
Yeah, thank you as well.
I really enjoyed your comments. Thank you.
I really want to learn more about what you're doing.